He brought his name from Africa, managed to keep it unlike anyone really that I had heard of. And he had this mixed race family. At the time, you just didn't think that really happened. So I became obsessed with finding out about it. And so I'll read a little bit about what I found in Virginia. Edward was probably about between 10 and 15 years old when he arrived in the year of the Indian attack of 1644. But he kept his own name, suggesting he was old enough to assert himself and may have been a Christian, for the English briefly afforded more rights to the converter. It was very rare for an African to retain his own name in the New World. Most were listed on arrival by Spanish, Portuguese, or English first name, followed by the word Negro or the country of origin, Antonio a Negro, Angela a Negro. And as they were sucked into the gathering stream of chattel slavery and became little more than property, they fell under their master's name. Young Edward became a servant of Colonel John Walker, one of the great planters and a member of the colony's legislature. When Walker died in 1668 in the Northern Neck, Edward stayed with his widow when she married Colonel John Stone. Edward most likely first sued for his freedom in county court, then the ruling was appealed to one side or other of the general court. The spelling of Edward's last name in the Jamestown court may have been arbitrary, the spelling varied greatly even among literate people's names, and it would waver and drift among his descendants. But by and large remained the way it is spelled that day. Remains today the way it was spelled that day. Edward lived another 40 years after he was freed, settling in the Northern Neck on or next to the property of Walker's daughter Anne and her husband. He married a woman named Margaret. They had 3 sons and grew tobacco and raised livestock in a little creek called Pantico Run on the border of Richmond and Westmoreland counties. What we know about Margaret is circumstantial. A professional genealogist wrote a lineage report on the Mozingos in 1990, concluding that she was the white daughter of Richard and Elizabeth Bailey, who were people of high station. The Bailey's son Samuel, a lawyer, lived next to Edward and Margaret and posted a bond to secure their appearance in a court case, something relatives commonly did. His name showed up in numerous land leases and lawsuits involving Edward and Margaret and 2 of their sons who survived to adulthood. If Samuel was not Margaret's brother, he was close to the family somehow. Debt was a way of life in Virginia, and lawsuits over payment of them were ubiquitous in the court record. Edward was as much a part of the system as anyone else. Despite the hardening of racism at the time, the court books show him standing up for themselves, suing for tobacco he felt he was owed, fighting for similar suits against him. Edward and Margaret appeared to be well established in society. From the lineage report, the neighbors and associates of Edward Mozingo were closely intermarried, so it must be presumed that they knew of Edward's birth status. His race must have been obvious. In spite of this, they interacted with him freely. His neighbors even called him Ned. So that's what I could find out about Edward. He had, when you look through his will, he had all sorts of middle class kind of items that showed he was moving up. But that quickly changed. One historian called the free blacks at that time a pariah class because they were pushed to the margins by slavery and the white supremacy system. And his kids and grandkids quickly fell into that. You see that they indentured themselves, they were getting in trouble with the law, they were drunk, they were always in trouble basically. And most of them then just kind of splintered off and started new families and came up with new myths of where they came from. So now I'll read quickly about one family that stayed right where Edward lived. And he's a direct descendant of Edward. His name is Junior Mozingo. He fished in the same creeks that Edward fished in. He had no idea that, a few generations back, his family was considered mulatto. He thought that they came as Italians in the 1800s. So here's my meeting with Junior. I turned up Cedar Grove Road and parked in the driveway of Junior's brick colonial era house. This is nice, I thought, but it looked empty. And honestly, it didn't seem like the home of a man whose actual birth certificate name was Junior, who named his own son Elvis. Then I saw someone crossing the street, waving from the front of an old wood-framed farmhouse and a scattering of old trucks and eviscerated appliances. Over here! I crossed over and parked next to a rusted tractor that collapsed in the dirt. And some rickety kennels along a great stand of trees, half a dozen hunting dogs clamored to be let out. They think they're going hunting, he said. How you doing? We shook hands. Good, thanks for meeting me. It's good to meet another Mozingo. Junior was short, solid, pale-skinned man of 66 with sharp hazel eyes and a broken vein burl of a nose. He wore a blue flannel shirt and a crinkled pack of Southern Pride tobacco in the pocket, and a stiff camouflage trucker's cap perched high on his head as his wind had discreetly dropped it there and might soon reclaim him. "Well, come on in," he said. We sat down at a worn maple table in the kitchen, and I told him I was looking into our ancestry. I started by asking him about his family. "We grew up by Farmer's Fork," he answered. "All them ones that I knew were from around there." "That's interesting," I said, "because we have a common ancestor who lived right by Farmer's Fork in the 1670s, Elle. So Mozingos have been there since then." "I guess so," he said. He said he only knew far back as his dad's granddaddy. He said he ran across other Mozingos now and then, mainly Socks Mozingo, who sold socks at the swap meet and lived up on Mozingo Road. "I think Socks is supposed to be kin to us," he said. Him and I were talking about it, but we don't know if we are or not. He also knew of a kind of buck Mozingos down the road, but he didn't know about them either. I asked him if he had ever talked to his father or uncle about the background. "They didn't talk about it, and we didn't ask," he said. "We knew not to ask about our old people back then." His tone suggested an aggressive lack of interest. "Did you wonder about the name? It's Italian, isn't it?" he said, shrugging. "I've heard that, yeah," I said. He went upstairs to get something. "Show him my deadheads, Mama," he called out. Mama was his wife, who called me into the sweltering living room, which had a big oil heater in the center. Half a dozen deer heads were mounted on the paneled wall. "You must have heard deer is dead, but couldn't be sure as the heads were both. He and Elvis shot these," she said. "Is Elvis around?" I asked. "No, he's out." "That one's a 10, Junior said, coming back down. "He's got 2 little kickers." He brought down the old Remington shotgun he'd inherited. "It's all I got from my granddad," he said. I gave it a feel and admired the craftsmanship, thinking of the Winchester .32 caliber on my parents' mantle, the only thing passed down by my father. We stepped back outside. The fields were gray and brittle with broken stalks of corn. Junior was just renting the house. For all their time here, the family had not amassed any land. They had only their hands to survive by working in mills or tilling depleted red soil on rented patches of land. His dad was a tenant farmer and never learned to read. He lost his thumb in a mill and signed his name with an X. Junior worked for 44 years at an elastic plant, still mowed lawns to help pay for the rent. Was this the invisible legacy of the pariah class, working generation after generation, rarely getting more than a step or 2 above subsistence? I found out that in the late 1700s, Junior's ancestors were still considered mixed race. 3 brothers of his 4th great-grandfather, John, appeared on the court registry of free mulattoes, which along with registries of free Negroes were kept so authorities knew which people of color were not enslaved. Status was fixed in these parts at the end of the 17th century, and the stigma of mixed race must have imprinted itself on the Mozingo family and been passed on in the collective consciousness for generations. The Walkers are still landed gentry with a good name, and the Mozingos are rednecks with a crazy name. Junior and I walked to the end of the drive, virtual scrapyard of pickups and blazers in varying degrees of dismantlement. He showed me how the tracking device on the truck monitored the whereabouts of his hunting dogs. He had 7 hounds and 4 beagles in the kennels. "What do the beagles go after?" "They run rabbits." I was stalling, trying to think of how to raise the race question. I envisioned myself making some dramatic proclamation of the truth, no matter how unwelcome it might be. But I suddenly felt that it would be a gimmick and not particularly wise, given all his guns. Who let us show up and bother this man with something he didn't want to hear? We chatted about more about Mozingos. His nephew was a minor baseball player famous around these parts. He mentioned that the buck Mozingos all have 1 green eye, 1 blue eye, and a white streak of hair. His mention of appearance gave me a lame way in. "What about the black Mozingos?" "Never heard that," he shot back. "Really, none?" "I heard there were some in North Carolina." "I never heard that." "Have you ever heard anyone say that the name might be African?" His look, with those sharp pupils, was the puzzled stare you might give to someone who, after an hour of conversation, you suddenly realize is insane. It was as if I'd asked him if he thought we were descended from a tribe of potted ferns. He said nothing. I let it go, thanked him for his time, and drove off.